Okay, a little bit about, the tools I'm going to be working with. If you're going to do leather working, you have to have needles. And I would suggest getting a packet of like 20 or 40 of them because they bend real easy as you're using them. And I would start off with getting needles that are sort of round on the tip. You need, most of them you'll want just round on the tip so you don't poke your fingers over and over again. It'll get real old having your fingers all pricked right here with needle marks. It's very frustrating. Now, whenever you're doing certain kinds of leather work, in my opinion, as an amateur, again I am an amateur, it's good to have some sharp needles for certain types of work. I wouldn't use them all the time, but like for instance when you're doing this zipper, and you don't want to punch holes in a zipper like right here, but if you want to stitch through a zipper or fabric, it's nice having the sharp needle because it'll go right through the zipper braiding or the fabric a lot easier. So needles, definitely a necessity. The other thing you really need, that's extremely important, are something to punch holes with. Now when I started off with something more like this. I bought a little cheap set that you can buy on eBay to punch holes with. And there was just a set of, looks like 1, 2, 3, 6, 4, let's see, a 6, 4, a 2, and a 1. And you can buy these cheap sets here for about 10 bucks. They're not bad. It's a good place to start. These are really good for doing sheaths in particular. I mean, really, that's what they're good for, sheaths and wallets. But if you're going to do anything large scale, like a bag, it gets really frustrating when you're trying to do 3 or 4 layers of leather, particularly thick leather, and trying to push a needle through these tiny holes. Because these holes end up being very frustrating to push needles through if you've got a lot of leather you're dealing with. Like right here, I'm trying to go through 3 layers right here. 3 layers right there. You can see here I'm going through the end of 2 pieces and a third one, as well as there's a stabilizer inside the leather here, and then 2 pieces of leather sandwiched together. So that's 4 layers of leather that this is going through. That's why it's ballooned out a little bit right there. Same over here. I didn't do a real good job of sandwiching the leather together, and I'll have to trim that later at some point and then, fix it. So this is what I do when I need to do a lot of leather. You can buy a cheap set, something like this. There's usually 4 pieces, 6, 4, 2, and 1, and it actually punches holes. See if I can get a good image of it right there. Doesn't seem to want to focus very well from the distance. But it basically has a bunch of holes in the center of it, and it literally punches holes in the leather, like this. You can see the holes are punched right there, and then you can use the round needles and poke right through it. For threading, I'd recommend buying a large spool of one kind. Don't waste your money buying a bunch of stuff unless you actually like doing this kind of stuff. And I chose black. And I'd make sure it's waxed. If you don't get waxed, it gets really annoying because the thread will fray. And you end up with this threading that's very difficult to work with because it's frayed. And you do not want that. So, waxed thread. And this was, I think, like 20 bucks for a spool of about 200 or 300 yards. I've used a fair amount of it already. Now as far as punching goes, if you want to do any kind of design work, and I've got a couple of pieces that I've done some design work, I'll show you, just to show you an example of what you can do. If you want to do any kind of design work, then get these out of the way here. If you want to do any kind of design work, you'll need punches. Like right here, I did an image of Roy Rogers, and I took and drew out the shape first, and then created the indentations using certain tools. And then afterwards I punched the holes in, and then I painted the different sections. So there's that. This is for this bag actually. And I also did a placard that'll fit up at the top here. And when it's done, it'll have like a Roy Rogers label on the top of it right here, like so. So those are the two design pieces that I've made for it already. And I'm going to go ahead and do a sort of trim similar to this right here, and it's going to go all the way around so that I cap off this zipper here and provide strength for the zipper pivot point, and it's going to go all the way along here, all the way around this side here, and then tie into this piece on the back where I'm going to do padding. So yeah, another thing that's nice to have, a punch set. Now there's a lot of people that'll talk about buying really expensive punches, and I mean you can go that route. You can buy really cheap punches and you can go that route too, or you can go in the middle. I think I spent $20 for this punch set at some point. You can see it's already rusting, it's kind of cheap, but it does the trick. You know, you punch a hole in and the leather piece slides up in here and then it just pops on out. I don't know what they call it, but other than it's a punch set. Another thing you might want to consider getting is alphabet stamps. So you can punch letters onto your leather. Now you can do a design like this where this is handmade. It's not done with any punch specific alphabet punches. Or you can do something like this where you can just literally punch whatever you want onto it using these punch tool. So you got basically a post here, and then you put the letter into the end of the post and then stamp into the leather. Pretty straightforward. And I got a larger alphabet set, I got a smaller one, I got really small one, Times New Roman I believe, not bad. Zipper caps here, bunch of different types of buttons, it's good to have. Now as I was saying about a hollow punch set, I originally went with something like this, and if I'm being honest, it sucks. It was supposed to be one of those you could, you know, push down like this and it would swivel inwards and all that. All it did was just create a problem. So I just capped it off with a little screw right there so it doesn't swivel down. And now whenever I want to use this, I just put the piece in. Problem is the piece doesn't want to stay in place. You punch down in and it pulls it out. Punch in, pull it out. So these little tips keep popping out of it, and it gets frustrating doing it over and over again. But I use it for, you know, the occasional job. And when I first started doing leather, I bought like a kit of a bunch of different types of wax threads. I mean, you can buy, you know, 12 of them in a pack, and there's maybe 50 yards for each one. So you can kind of get a feel for what kind of colored wax threading you want to use. It's not a bad way to go. I tried this originally to do beveling. It works for larger pieces, but that's about it. These, I bought a whole pack of these things thinking, oh yeah, these are great. Use them one time and they look like this. And you can't use it for any other color. So I'm like, oh, that's kind of a waste. So what did I do? Got away from that. You can buy a whole big pack of Q-tips. 750 Q-tips that'll do the same thing. And they're really good for doing edges and all that. And you know, and it's like $7 or $8 and you got 750 of them rather than spending 50 cents a piece for those things. Also, I bought a whole kit of different types of paints, and I've had these for like 2 years and haven't even used hardly any of them at all. But what you will use a lot of is dye. Bottom line is dye is always a good solution when you're trying to do leather, especially when you're doing a lot of scrap pieces. Like I have all these different scrap pieces, a lot of white, because I like the white. You can put it, you make it any color you want, and it starts out just pure white, or mostly white, like slightly grayish there, but you can dye it any color you want. And that allows you to do stuff like what I did with that Roy Rogers thing. So I have a whole bunch of scrap pieces that I buy in bundles for 40 bucks. You know, the kind of pieces left over from you know, people that were doing upholstery or whatever and didn't need all the small pieces. So you have like a bunch of little scrap pieces of different designs I did that I decided not to use for anything. And I even got this idea I was going to do heat press, where I would heat press these images onto leather, and that would be really cool and neat. Problem is that most leather burns when you do a heat press on it. So even if you buy the right kind of heat press material, most of your leather wrinkles up and burns when you try to use it. So it really is touch and go. Although I will say lamb or sheep hide is one of the best leathers for that kind of work. I don't know why, but heat press works really well with it. Okay, so like I said, I've got this bag I'm working on. Another thing you're going to want is something to cut the leather with. Now when I started, I just figured I would use an X-Acto knife. Pretty straightforward. You can buy them anywhere. Very handy. And you're definitely going to want a metal ruler. And a healing pad is also very handy. Otherwise you're cutting up your surface really badly. Problem is you get tired of trying to cut with this because it's really hard to do it uniform. So eventually you get tired of dealing with it, so you go to one of these, rotary cutters. And the rotary cutters are great for doing sharp, doing straight cuts and getting a nice clean cut using a metal ruler. Now the other thing you want to consider when you're doing that, if you're going to do that, it's a lot cheaper to buy in quantity. So what I did was I just bought a spool of like 50 blades, $10. You can buy a whole spool of 50 blades, other razor blades. I bought a whole bunch of these, X-Acto blades. You buy them in quantity, you'll save a lot of money if you buy in quantity for this stuff. And now, one of the other things, when you're doing a lot of leather, you're going to want metal clips. It sucks trying to get leather together if you don't have something to clip onto them, to clip the pieces together. So the only problem with these is they're a little bit too strong, and they can actually leave an indentation on the leather. So if that's an issue for you, it's nice to have like wooden blocks. And if you're going to use wooden blocks, really thin ones, this one's a little bit large. This one's more suited for a clamp like this. You can get two metal blocks and sandwich the leather in between it and get a nice, good, strong clamp onto a piece of leather when you're gluing. And for gluing, tried all kinds of stuff. It's really hard to beat rubber cement, pure and simple. I would suggest rubber cement if you're going to do something for gluing. And sometimes it's handy having a little set of cutting attachments that you can do all kinds of different, crap, I can't get the thing open, figures. You know, they don't make them easy to open, you know. See, this one's already rusting, real cheap set. I don't think I spent more than $20 for it, and they give you a bunch of shapes. And they actually cut really well, considering how cheap these things are. Hate to say it, but China does make really cheap stuff. So if you want to get started, you can do something really quick and cheap and get into it. $100, you could buy most of what you'd need to start off with, and then slowly build up your set from there. In fact, you can buy a kit of a whole bunch of cheap Chinese stamps. You know, you got to be careful when you stamp them. You'll just bend them in half. Like some of these, you know, you can see that thing is literally bent because I've used it enough that, you know, it bends. Now, what do you stamp onto? That's another question. If I'm being honest, I started off using like a block of marble, but I had a nice marble block that was about yay long, yay big, and it literally broke into pieces from stamping. Even getting leather wet, it's not always easy to stamp leather. So I eventually just bought a big block of metal, like this. And I don't even have to hit very hard. With wet leather, stamping onto this, it always leaves a decent impression. Never fails. Now I did think it'd be a great idea to get a sewing machine, so I thought I'd go real cheap and buy one and retrofit. Bad idea. This is not a walking foot. It just does not work very good for leather. If you're going to get a leather sewing machine, get a leather sewing machine that has a walking foot on it and works properly. But I will say, if you want to do a lot of leather sheaths and whatever, a vacuum sealer is very handy. Because you can, put a sheath or a wallet or something in a bag, vacuum seal it, and it's really good for gluing the pieces together so that you can stitch them and they stay in place. So yeah, I've got a lot of little things here that I've built up over the time. A nice little kit here that allows you to do the different snap buttons and everything. If you're going to buy snap caps and rivets and all that, make sure they're stainless. It sucks to go and do all this work on something and then end up with something that's not stainless, and literally within a year it's rusting. Literally rusting. Very frustrating to do all that work and then have something rust on you. As far as wallets go, badge holders are a good way to go if you're going to do wallet, the transparent section for a wallet, in my opinion. Someone might disagree, but there's always somebody that thinks they know more. They probably do. It wouldn't surprise me. I buy these at Walmart because when you're doing dye or paint, you don't want to pour it back into the bottle. So I pour a little bit into one of these disposable cups with a lid, kind of like sample lid cups that you can buy at Walmart for, I think, 50 of them for $4 or $5. And it really helps to have dye, paint, or whatever in these things. And then it keeps you from having to pour it back into the bottles. Now I bought a cheap leather kit that had a bunch of stuff like this in it. And this is handy to have because it's a nice flat plastic and it's really good for stamping. But I don't really like the fact that it's round because it slides off the end of your stamp if you're not careful. Now, I shouldn't, but I actually use a metal hammer for that because this really is really good for stamping to make sure that it doesn't slide off the back of the stamp. So I just haven't, sprung for a nice rubber mallet, which I probably should. As you can see, Q-tips. I use Q-tips for a lot of that kind of work. So you want to collect a lot of different things. Markers are handy. It's very nice having markers because you're always marking something, and pencils just don't show up very good on leather, except the white leather. It's really hard to get a pencil to show up on some of these leather pieces, Very frustrating. So markers and dye markers are handy, particularly if you're doing any kind of detailed work, like the face of that Roy Rogers that I did. For sheaths, buy a packet of your leather belt clips and make a really good sheath. And buttons, snap buttons. It's good to buy a nice, large quantity of snap buttons because you're going to need them, no question about it. So that's my basic setup. I do have an anvil for some work that I do. And it's handy to have, some tools. Like this is a cheapy Chinese-made skiver where you sort of skive the leather. It doesn't work very well. But one thing this is really good for is when you're trying to cut shapes and stuff, pushing down through the leather. This is sharp enough, it cuts right through. It's a nice, decent thing. You have to have a decent beveler. This isn't a decent one, but the good ones are, too expensive. So I buy a cheap one and I just keep sharpening it over and over again. These are the rest of the stamps that I was telling you about, these hole punch stamps. Like I said, a set of 4. It's 6, 4, 2, and the one's around here somewhere. I don't know. I never use it. I mean, it's time consuming just to punch one hole. But this, you can see, I've used so much that I've bent the back of it. Now, some people have these really nice plastic sheets to stamp into, but they're expensive. Where you can buy just a wooden cutting board, and you can get a wooden cutting board for $20. They're cheap. Bamboo, really cheap. And when you get it chopped up so badly, you just toss it and buy another one. Because you have to toss and do the other ones anyway. So that is, here you go. Here's one of those clips I was telling you about. I made this little eyeglass cover. Not the best, but it's one of my first projects, and what can you say about your first projects? They always look sort of But these metal clips are really good for making sheaths in particular. And when you want to do a design that of something, I did this one design. This was one of my first designs that I stamped in of you-know-who. So, again, it's good to have stamp tools for that. And when you're doing holsters, it's good to have these blanks made of a particular gun. This is a 1911, so that if you go to make a holster for the 1911, you can actually do a decent one. I made this one by hand, and it's okay, not great. It's a little bit smaller, unfortunately. So when I made the holster for the guy, he wasn't terribly happy about the end result, unfortunately. A Dremel really comes in handy with certain things, particularly if you're going to do any kind of edging. You want to have something that you can burnish the edges really easily with, because it gets tiresome trying to do it by hand. And like I say, having a lot of different kinds of leather is very handy. Have all kinds of different leather. Soft leather makes really good bags, but it also doesn't make stiff bags that will stand up like this piece right here, because that will stand up on its own. It's kind of neat to have. A little heavy, but it's strong and sturdy. So that is a bunch of paint brushes, of course, because you're going to use them when you want to do detailed dye work or paint work for that matter. And that's basically my leather setup. It's pretty straightforward. This is very handy. You're going to do any kind of detailed work. Having a magnifying glass with a light allows you to really zoom in on work and get a nice, strong image. If you're going to do any kind of detailed work, it's handy having a magnifying lens for that. There's the heat press over there, and some bins just for putting stuff in and all that. So that's it. Oh, right. Also have a bunch of bins with stuff in it. Foam brushes. Foam brushes are really good for laying down a lot of dye at once. Sandpaper, steel wool for certain kinds of work. Belts, straps, Velcro, buckles, ribbons, eyedroppers, funnels, patterns. It's really nice having patterns because it sucks to do pattern drafting. Quite frankly, it will literally take you 10 times longer if you do your own pattern. I swear it just takes forever. And half the time it doesn't work out and you end up throwing it away, and it's frustrating. You waste leather, waste time. So patterns are really nice. Now if you want to do your own pattern, I'm going to do a video on how to pattern draft, and it's very frustrating, time consuming. But when you do something you really like, it is rewarding. So glues, of course you got to have different kinds of glues. That was something I was going to do and never really did. Did it one time, and then what I ended up doing nobody liked, so I wasted a lot of money and time on that. And of course my die cups. Paper towels, very handy, because you use a lot of them. And a whole bunch of lighters, because you have to burn that wax thread to really make it, set in place. Otherwise it'll just slide right out of there. Resin, that's like a acrylic finish for leather. Handy to have. Gel antique works in conjunction with the resin. And you can also, if you'd rather just go old school, get something like mink oil. It gives it sort of an oiled finish that's waterproof, and you just have to do it over and over again about every year or two. But that's another good way to go. So I believe that's everything that I've covered. I don't think there's anything left that I basically use. I have a whole bunch of buckles that I bought that I was going to put these on that bag, and let's be honest, it's overkill. Nice, but overkill. And you're going to end up doing that sometimes where you do something and afterwards you're like, oh, this is not going to work. Like the bottom of this thing, I'm still fretting over it, and I know I'm going to have to cut it out of there, and it's a little frustrating considering how much work it took to put it in place, just to have to rip it out and redo it. That concludes my second YouTube video on leather tools. It's just an introduction. As I do the various videos through which I'm planning to do more of, hopefully one every 2 or 3 days, what I'm hoping for, I'll get a little more specific on all kinds of different tools that you might want to use. But the gist of this video was to say, hey, if you want to start out and you don't want to buy a bunch of stuff, there are 3 basic things you need: leather needles, thread that is waxed, and something to punch holes with in leather, and a piece of leather, of course. Those 4 things will allow you to start a project very, very simply. With that said, the next video is literally a pattern drafting video, a beginner's pattern drafting video for amateurs. It's just a simple case for my eyeglass lens cleaning equipment, but it can be used just as a leather pouch as well, credit cards, whatever. And I am going to set up an Etsy account that allows you to download the pattern just as an image for free that you can print out and then just cut the letter according to the image. Or you can actually download and pay for the specific vector pattern that I've created, that shows you where to cut out everything, etc., etc. And that'll be in the next video. Beginning project, pattern drafting, eyeglass lens cleaning case. This is Leather Botcher Extraordinaire. Thank you for watching.